I'm going to begin today's musing by sharing a quote that I've used many times in the past. And I want you to first think, have you heard this quote before? But second, you think it's true or false? Do you think this is a quote that can be documented and is real and legit? Or do you think it's one of these apocryphal, internet things that someone claims someone long ago said this, but they actually didn't? This one from the first presidency, 1941. I had shared this quote a number of times on my blog, the old Connor's Conundrums of years ago. And I want to know if you've heard about it, and then we'll get into it. So here is the quote. The church, as a church, does not believe in war, and yet, since its organization, whenever war has come, we've done our part. We do thoroughly believe in building up our home defenses to the maximum extent necessary. But we do not believe that aggression should be carried on in the name and under the false cloak of defense. We therefore look with sorrowing eyes at the present use, to which a great part of the funds being raised by taxes and by borrowing is being put. We believe that our real threat comes from within and not from without. And it comes from the underlying spirit common to Nazism, fascism, and communism, namely the spirit which would array class against class, which would set up a socialistic state of some sort, which would rob the people of the liberties which we possess under the Constitution, and would set up such a reign of terror as exists now in many parts of Europe. All right. Number one, have you heard that quote before? I've been surprised when I've done past musings and I've talked about, quotes that I considered to be fairly common. A lot of people are like, I've never heard that before. So curious, number one, were you familiar with that? But number two, what do you think? I mean, that's strong for the first presidency to be saying this in 1941 with obviously the context of World War II, gearing up and going on in Europe and so forth. So do you think it's legit? Do you think the first presidency actually said something like this? Very stern, very political, very focused and saying that, we think all this buildup of military is problematic, right? As World War II or America's involvement in World War II is picking up. Now, there's a larger portion of this quote that appears in a good book called Moral Basis of a Free Society by H. Verlin Anderson. Definitely a book worth picking up if you haven't read it. And so based on that reference, I had been using this quote for years. I would talk about this quote in various contexts, right? When talking about, political stuff or war or history or whatever. And I had someone challenge the veracity of this quote. They disputed whether the first presidency actually said it. They challenged me to substantiate my claim and to provide evidence that this quote was actually legit, more than just, hey, it was quoted once in this book. So I went on a little bit of a investigative research project. This is 2009 when I did this. I called the Church History Library. I called the BYU Library. The only source that any of them were aware of when I would talk about this quote, as they looked into it, was Elder Anderson's book. And this letter was allegedly addressed to the Treasury Department of the United States government. So I reached out to the National Archives. They couldn't find it. I was sharing on Facebook at the time, hey, I'm looking at this. Here's who I called today. So I was kind of open with this project, and as a result, someone sent me a tip that the letter from which this quote comes might be in the collection of files from Mariner Eccles, and this was at the University of Leipzig. Who's Mariner Eccles? So Eccles was the seventh chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was a banker. For over 13 years, he was chairman of the Fed. He was a member of the LDS Church. And so he was in charge of the Fed during the New Deal, during World War II. So while FDR and all these guys are just creating tons of programs and increasing spending, Eccles in his position is fueling it and creating new money and injecting it into the economy. He was born, Eccles was, to a polygamist family. He went to Brigham Young College. At the time it was Brigham Young College. Went on a mission to Scotland. Became a millionaire by age 22. As I said, a banker, total Keynesian. If you know your economics at all, he was a total Keynesian. Basically just means like whatever can help the government in a very simple nutshell. And let's stimulate the economy, and let's, it's not free market at all. So FDR appoints him to be chairman of the Fed. And so I started looking into this. I got that tip. I go to the University of Utah. They had 250 boxes of letters and transcripts and memos. I spent an hour going over just the index to all of these boxes, trying to figure out like what box might a letter like this be in if it's actually true. Finally, after just hours of digging through boxes and looking through all these papers, I found the letter. Along with a few related letters that referred to the First Presidency's correspondence. So now I had evidence. This is contemporary evidence. This is from his personal collection of letters from 1940s. So the historical context here, I'm going to lay that out before we then get into the letter, because this letter has a lot of meat in it, has a lot of powerful stuff beyond that quote that people, including myself, have shared. There's a lot of other interesting nuggets in here. But before we address them, I want to set the context. So at the time in 1941, who's in the First Presidency? It's Heber Grant, David McKay, and J. Reuben Clark. And FDR, of course, had been the president. Grant really disliked the New Deal. I'm going to read a portion from a book called Presidents and Prophets. This is a book that kind of catalogs the interactions between leaders of the church and leaders of the United States government. And in that book, it says that President Grant would often become upset when discussing FDR, and in one heated discussion, slammed his cane on the desk, shattering the glass desktop in his anti-Roosevelt fury. It comes as no surprise, then, that in the election of 1936, President Grant openly endorsed the Republican candidate for president, Alf Landon. However, he pointed out that he was speaking only for himself and not for the church. First Counselor J. Reuben Clark Jr. was not only anti-Roosevelt, but he was very much in favor of Landon. Governor Alf Landon of Kansas will make a great president, he told reporters gathered in the First Presidency's office. President Clark, in his capacity, like while in the First Presidency, travels the West, stumping for Landon, basically campaigning for him. He helped write the GOP platform that year, Clark did, and was privately assured by Landon that if he won, Clark would be appointed Secretary of the State if Republicans succeeded in defeating Roosevelt. As the 1936 election drew near, an unsigned front-page editorial in the church-owned Deseret News accused FDR of knowingly promoting unconstitutional laws and advocating communism. However, quote, the other candidate, Landon, has declared he stands for the Constitution and for the American system. Now, although many Roosevelt-loving Mormons were upset over the editorial, one future church leader was persuaded. Future First Presidency member Marion Romney, a staunch Democrat committed to voting for Franklin Roosevelt, was deeply torn. When the editorial appeared, Romney's biographer said he felt as if his political life had collapsed around him. After fasting and 3 hours of prayer, Marion concluded that the editorial was inspired and given through the Lord's prophet. He then reversed his political loyalties and labored to dissuade his friends from voting for Roosevelt. Pause here. This is just, another little arrow in the quiver of saying the Deseret News and the KSL need to be sold off because of this perception, right? Like when you have an editorial, is that the prophet speaking? Is that from God? Is it just the editorial editor, the opinion editor at the paper, on their own? Is it that they're running everything through the First Presidency? When do these things have, direction and oversight from church leaders, and when do they not? It creates a lot of confusion. And in this case, you got Marion Romney, after fasting and praying, coming to believe that the editorial against FDR was from God. Very interesting to see how those dynamics play out. All right, let's wrap up this quote from Presidents and the Prophets. In 1936, Roosevelt won every state in the Union, except for Maine and Vermont. As convincing as the victory was nationally, it was even more so in Utah, where FDR had over 69% of the vote. Determined that Utah should not support FDR's bid for a third term in 1940, the general authorities once again drafted an anti-Roosevelt statement, but settled on issuing a less dramatic, unsigned editorial in the Deseret News. President Grant deferred to those who thought too bold a statement would cause problems for the church without much hope of changing votes, and came to the horrifying conclusion that about, quote, half the Latter-day Saints almost worship him. That was a quote from Grant, referring to FDR. He regarded the strong LDS support for FDR, the president, as his, quote, and his, quote, neo-socialism, as, quote, one of the most serious conditions that has confronted me since I became president of the church. Goes on to say that, of course, in 1940, FDR won. 62% of the vote in Utah. Grant was dumbfounded. And part of the explanation, according to the book, was that the fact that up to 3/4 of the population of rural Utah received federal relief. They were basically getting subsidies from the federal government and wanted them to continue. They had a financial interest in supporting FDR. Okay, so this 1941 letter, it was written to the Treasury. We're going to get into that here in just a second. And it was given to an FDR appointee by an anti-FDR First Presidency. So that's the context. An anti-FDR First Presidency is writing this letter to FDR's Treasury Department. Okay, so why was the letter even written at all? What was the purpose that motivated the First Presidency to write this letter? Well, there was a war bond campaign trying to raise funds for World War II. And there was a federal agency created called the National Organizations Division, very sexy name. And it was created as a result of the Treasury Secretary's desire to ask all private organizations of citizens of nationwide scope to present the Defense Savings Program to their members. So the federal government, under the Treasury Department, creates the National Organization Division with the express purpose of going out to all of these national civic organizations, private organizations, and inducing them to share with their members that, hey, buy some war bonds and help finance the war. So the National Organizations Division sends a letter. We don't know the date. I don't have it in Eccles records. Presumably it was early to mid 1941. And they send a letter to the First Presidency, as they are to many other organizations. They solicited the First Presidency's support for the Defense Savings Bonds Program and asked them to encourage members of the church to participate. So the First Presidency then replies to Mr. Fitzgibbon. This is the agent of the National Organizations Division, the guy kind of in charge. So the First Presidency replies to Fitzgibbon, and then he replied back to them. Okay, so they've now opened a correspondence. These letters were not in the file. So we don't have the original letter that was sent to the First Presidency. We don't have, maybe it's in the First Presidency vault, but I don't have access to the letter that was sent to the First Presidency, or that they wrote back, or that Fitzgibbon then replied. So there's some early correspondence here that was not included in the file. But what we do have, what was in Eccles' file, was an 18-page letter, the second response that the First Presidency sends out to Mr. Fitzgibbon. Now, the question then becomes, why did Fitzgibbon have a letter, excuse me, I said that wrong. Why did Eccles have a letter between the First Presidency and Mr. Fitzgibbon in the Treasury? Well, Mr. Fitzgibbon, when he received this 18-page letter, forwarded a copy to Eccles, knowing that he was a member of the church, and of course he's the chairman of the Fed, very influential and very close with the Treasury. Fed chairman and Treasury officials are always very close because they're working in cahoots to devalue the dollar and inflate the currency and steal your purchasing power. So Fitzgibbon's like, oh my gosh, look at this letter, sends it over to Eccles. A copy of it, that is how it lands in Eccles' records. So here's December 10th, 1941. And the assistant to Fitzgibbon, his name is Mr. Hudeling, he writes to Eccles, I'm enclosing herewith a copy of the letter received by my assistant, William Fitzgibbon. Okay, so Fitzgibbon is the assistant to Hudeling. From the First Presidency of the Mormon Church, outlining the position of the First Presidency toward the Defense Savings Program, and also expressing a considerable lack of sympathy with the policies of the present national administration. This is the letter about which I told you at Ernest Draper's last night. So they had some social event, and Hudeling, so Hudeling's above Fitzgibbon. Hudeling's like, hey, Eccles, I'm going to send you this letter. You got to check it out, right? Now, if you want to read this whole letter, you can go to connorboyack.com/1941. And that will redirect you to the blog post I wrote at the time where I document all this, and there's a link there to download the full thing, read it yourself. I scanned all the letters I could get my hands on, and that's where this comes from. So connorboyack.com/1941. Now, the first part of this letter goes through a variety of things. We're not going to spend much time there. It's talking about a description of the church's organization, particularly the welfare program and its effectiveness. It talks about the spiritual values underlying church operations, the special relationship between the Constitution and the church and the desire to preserve the Constitution. They talk about the principles of self-reliance and industry and charity, They stress the importance of economic self-sufficiency, industriousness, and then that the church has made significant investment in education and cultural activities. So they're kind of charting this like, hey, we want you to understand how we do things as a church to give context to what we're about to say, which we're going to now get into. So they lay this foundation of like, here's how the church operates. Here's where we put our time, attention, and energy and resources, right? And so you need to know that for us to then have the context to say this. So then they get into it. Here's what it next says after going through this whole foundation. Viewing all of these things, everything that they just explained, it will be easy for you to understand that the church has not found it possible to follow along the lines of the present general tendency in the matter of property rights, taxes, the curtailment of rights and liberties of the people, nor in general the economic policies of what is termed the New Deal. The great bulk of what these people are trying to do is, in final analysis, absolutely contrary to the fundamental principles of which we have spoken. It is the long considered opinion of President Grant and those who are associated with him that our nation cannot be preserved if the present governmental policies shall continue. We do not believe that any other great nation or great civilization can be built up or maintained by the use of such policies. As we see one liberty after another encroached upon, we look with deepest anxiety toward the possibility of an attempt to take away religious freedom from the American people. We went through this experience in our early days. We know from the histories of our fathers and our grandfathers what it means to be deprived of the right to worship God according to the dictates of our consciences and of the hardships and tragedy that accompany such a denial. We face this situation and this possibility, we repeat, with deepest apprehension. Okay, now they're going to respond to something that Hudeling said. So what Hudeling said in his letter, we don't have that letter, but we have, they quote, oh, you just said in your letter this, and they quote it. So here's what Hudeling said in the letter. Help us now to teach our citizens everywhere how to preserve and perpetuate our freedom. Freedom to govern ourselves, freedom of speech, and freedom to worship God according to our own light. So that is the pitch that the Treasury Assistant Secretary to the Treasury is making, trying to solicit support of the First Presidency, saying, help us teach our citizens how to perpetuate and preserve our freedom. Here's how the First Presidency replied. As we see it, there is no way in which we can, to use your own words, preserve and perpetuate our freedom, etc., except we shall turn away from our present course and resume the normal course along which this great country traveled to its present high eminence of prosperity, of culture, of universal education, and of the peace and contentment which we enjoyed prior to the inauguration of the New Deal. These things are not matters of partisan politics with us. We care nothing as church leaders about partisan politics as such, nor about the dominance of one party over the other. We grant to every man the right to vote as he wishes, and we would not control his vote even if we could. But we do reserve to ourselves the right to tell our people what we think is right regarding politics as affecting the fundamentals of our government system, to warn them of the dangers that lie under the present course, and to try to persuade them that their peace, their happiness, and their security do not lie along the path of present trends of government. Then they make an interesting admission that they have a seeming inability, as we outlined in the historical context, that foundation, an inability to persuade the members of the church on political matters, as evidenced by Grant and others being very against FDR, and yet in Utah, which was at the time very predominantly LDS, FDR getting a majority of the vote. First Presidency says, truly, we do not believe that we can preserve and perpetuate our freedom unless we turn squarely about and return to the old-time virtues and re-enthrone our liberties and free institutions. We have done in the past, we are doing now, and we shall continue in the future to do everything within our power to secure this turning about of which we speak. We confess to you that it has not been possible for us to unify our own people, even upon the necessity of such a turning about. And therefore we cannot, unfortunately, and we say it regretfully, make any practical suggestion to you as to how the nation can be turned about. But the President of the United States could do it in good part if he were willing to exert his effort along that line. But this he appears not to be willing to do. Now we have said all of the foregoing with a complete understanding in our own minds that we have said nothing or little of anything that may now be of practical value to you. But this much we feel we can definitely say, that unless the people of America forsake the sins and the errors, political and otherwise, of which they're now guilty, and return to the practice of the great fundamental principles of Christianity and of constitutional government, there will be no exaltation for them spiritually, and politically we shall lose our liberty and our free institutions. Now, it's very clear to me that President Clark is the one drafting all this. This sounds a lot like him. He's a, political animal. He's had political appointments and employment. And so it's clear that obviously President Grant approved this, but this is, being driven or written by President Clark. Immediately after this, the letter goes into the quoted portion. I'm not going to read that whole thing again, just reiterating that it stresses that we don't believe in aggression under the false cloak of defense. And, we're not really animated about the current situation that so much of these taxes and borrowing is being spent. And so anyways, we next get into that portion of the quote. What's funny is what comes right after it. They say in the First Presidency letter, "We trust you will pardon this long letter, but we feel we must say that you invited it." So whatever he said in the second letter, presumably they send a letter. First Presidency, I'm just theorizing, was like, no, we're not going to do that. Sorry, count us out. So then presumably Hewdeling writes back, the Treasury Assistant Secretary was like, oh, come on, help us, we really need. And so now they're saying, oh, we think that you invited it. Here's this 18-page, boom, this letter. So then Eccles, he replies to Hewdeling on January 30th, 1942. This is a few weeks after the First Presidency letter was sent. He says, I've only recently gotten around to reading the enclosure you sent me. As you can surmise, I found it every bit as unenlightened as I had expected. So that's Eccles, a member of the church, chairman of the Fed, talking to his Treasury counterpart. 1 month later, Eccles writes to Hewdeling again. He encloses a Deseret News editorial, and that editorial reads in part, "Investment in bonds combines both self-interest and patriotism. The defense bonds are the best investment in the world for the individual. The purchase of bonds is not only an investment for the victory in the war, it is contributing to the peace to follow victory." So let's pause there before I get into what Eccles said. This, again, I've shared examples before with war and Elder Nelson after 9/11 and so forth, but if people have a perception, as Marion Romney did, right, fasting and praying for hours because of this editorial, attacking FDR, here, if people are seeing a Deseret News editorial and this presumption, especially back in the 40s, that editorials are basically from the First Presidency, at least blessed by them or approved by them or reviewed by them or whatever, right? Here is this editorial. Now, the letter of which I'm speaking, this letter I'm sharing, was not public. This was private correspondence going back and forth, right? And other than this little quote getting out, I don't know how it worked its way into Elder Anderson's book, this portion of the quote. That'd be very interesting to find out. But the full, letter had not been revealed until I found it in the archives in 2009 and then published it on my blog. And so members of the church at the time, in the 40s, who believed often that editorials are kind of the First Presidency message in a way, would then believe that the First Presidency was supportive of the war bonds and thus the war. And that's the perception that was allowed to go out there. First Presidency privately saying all this stuff to the Treasury, privately communicating this stuff, but publicly with the Deseret News singing a totally different tune. Investment in bonds combines self-interest and patriotism. It's not only an investment for victory in the war, but the peace that shall follow victory. So this editorial, as I said, it was clipped and enclosed from Eccles to Hewdeling. Again, Eccles, member of the church, and he's sending it over to the Treasury. They've been talking. They were at the social event. They've been sharing, these documents back and forth. So Eccles is like, hey, check out this editorial. And Eccles writes to Hewdeling, "As you may know, the Deseret News is a daily newspaper of general circulation that is owned and controlled by the Mormon Church. If the editorial policy of this paper reflects the attitude of the church authorities, as one would naturally expect, this editorial indicates that the church members have greatly changed, that church leaders have greatly changed their views respecting support by their members of the government's financing program, in particular the distribution of savings bonds. The contrast with the attitude expressed in their letter is quite striking." So Eccles, thinking that First Presidency is way off base, in his first reply to the letter, he's like, I found it very, whatever he said, uninspiring or very, what did he say? I found it every bit as unenlightened as I had expected. So here now with this editorial, it's like, we might naturally expect that the editorial policy of the Deseret News reflects the attitude of church authorities, they have greatly changed their views. Here, the First Presidency was establishing this broad foundation of, church kind of systems and principles and all of these things that are long-standing, right? They even said in the statement, this is the long-standing view of President Grant. And so then all of a sudden, just days basically later, just weeks later in early January 1942, you get an editorial that's saying something different. You get a statement from the Deseret News that purports to show the position of the church authorities, as Eccles himself is saying. Now you might say, well, in the intervening time, we had Pearl Harbor, right? December 7th, 1941. And this letter was written, what did I say? I think it was December 10th the First Presidency letter, the 18-page letter, was written October 11th, 1941. And then it was later, let's see, there was something in December that I'm not finding now, but the letter was October, and then Eccles and Hughteling are replying, weeks later. So what one might conclude from that, perhaps Eccles would interpret that as, Pearl Harbor changed everything, and all of a sudden the church wants to now, just like post 9/11 with the example I shared in a past musing, we want to do our part. We don't want everyone to look at us as, traitors or like unsupportive of fighting back. So the First Presidency goes silent, puts out or allows to be put out this editorial from the paper saying, "Go war bonds," and that's in January of 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor. So perhaps the First Presidency did have an about face. Perhaps they looked at the political calculations and felt that despite writing that private letter, that it was best to publicly kind of go along with the agenda of where the sentiment of the people were. We got to, get vengeance, Pearl Harbor. We got to, get involved in this war, despite FDR previously campaigning on not getting involved in the war and keeping our boys away from the European theater of war. And so one might conclude that, Pearl Harbor changed everything. I'll leave that interpretation to you. Curious to know your thoughts if you surmise that that's what's going on here. It's very curious, though, right? The First Presidency is privately saying something, and then just weeks later is publicly allowing or encouraging or requiring something in the editorial of the paper to say something totally different than what they just, 2-3 months prior in October had been saying to the Treasury. All right, final reply in the documents that I have is from Hughteling, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. So Eccles has just sent him the editorial of the Deseret News with these comments, the greatly changed, and the contrast with the attitude expressed in their letter is quite striking. This is what Eccles is saying. Hughteling replies and says that the editorial very ably endorses the defense savings program of the Treasury. I am particularly pleased to get this fine endorsement from the admirable newspaper owned and controlled by the Mormon Church. It represents a most favorable contrast to the isolationist attitude expressed by the First Presidency of the Church in their letter. So, of course, Hughteling is happy. He's getting what he wants. He's getting, the church publicly through the Deseret News endorsing the program. That was the whole initiative, the whole purpose for reaching out to begin with. So he's dismissing the letter as, isolationist. He's now buttering up the paper, this admirable newspaper, this fine endorsement. People just communicated in a far different way 60, 70 years ago. So that's it in the documents. To me, it's a very insightful look into the inner workings of the First Presidency and organizational management. How are they going to interact with the government, not publicly, but privately? And, it makes you wonder what other correspondence and communication has gone on in the decades before and since that we don't have access to because it's, being said or written privately. Kind of fascinating to get this little peek. One might be very curious, as I am, about what's in the First Presidency vault, and a lot more correspondence like this that might show the true sentiments and feelings of church leaders, despite publicly having to be, politically correct and calculating and doing things strategically through the Deseret News rather than saying it themselves. There's a lot of calculus that goes into what to say and how to say it and who will say it. So kind of fascinating to get the peek. Curious to know the comments, what you think. Had you seen that quote before? Again, the letter, if you want to go read it, connorboyack.com/1941. It's fascinating to read the whole thing. And the letter itself has annotations on it from Eccles. He's, adding an exclamation point here and underlining this. And so he's kind of reacting in real time as he's reading this. So it's interesting to see what he is, reacting to, how he's reacting emphasizing particular things and being surprised at other things. So ConnorBoyack.com/1941. We'll leave it there. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you next Sunday.